Hello, and welcome to our webcast for February 8, 2019. My name is Christian Debré, and this is Amy Asbrook, the director of Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet.
Hello.
And just over there, it is Taylor Hyatt, our outreach coordinator and
Policy
analyst.
Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet is a non-religious organization by and for people with disability and our allies. Our goal is to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability rights opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other ending of life practices that discriminates against people with disabilities. Today's topic, the CCA report, Something About Us Without Us, Part 4. Mental disorder. And basically, I think there are some people in there who had mental disorder.
No,
we don't want to dehumanize anyone.
Yeah, anyway. Okay, so
No comment.
no comment. The CCA reports, Council of Canadian Academies reports. We are presenting the last in our series on the Council of Canadian Academies reports. This one on assisted suicide and euthanasia, where a mental disorder is the only medical condition causing the request. This is undoubtedly the most complex, interesting, and difficult of the three reports. And it was like pulling teeth to put together this webcast. Oh my gosh. Okay. A note on terminology. The report uses an abbreviation for the phrase medical assistance in dying and mental disorder for mental disorders as the sole underlying medical condition, or made MD sunk throughout. In general, we try to avoid jargon. However, we're not always able to work around the phrase and its abbreviation in the quotes. So you will hear made MD sunk.
I just can't believe you're trying to pronounce it.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. It's important to keep straight the different kinds of situations we're talking about here. And I'm working away and I'm realizing, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot, there's stuff going on here that they're not really making clear. So a small number of people who are involuntarily committed to psychiatric hospital because they are a danger to themselves are prevented from killing themselves. Okay, that's one group. The second group is some people are discouraged from killing themselves via suicide prevention interventions by hotline volunteers, therapists, and publicly funded outreach programs like the Bell Let's Talk program, whose commercials I really, really, really hate. And finally, some people are being selected to receive help to kill themselves or to be killed. So some people are being selected to die. And those are the three groups we need to keep in mind. And it can get a little confusing, but just sort of keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind about the CCA reports is that they are focusing they're discussing whether to expand the program before we even know how medical assistance in dying is working in Canada or not.
Yes, we have talked about it many times.
Yeah.
The quantity of data needed to examine if the program is working or not is not sufficient.
Right. And in fact, the program was in effect for 2.5 years before they even got their surveillance program going. And that program, you know, the monitoring doesn't even track important information that we need to know.
To be sure that the program worked the way it's supposed to work.
Right.
But we doesn't know.
Right.
So
exactly.
how to take decisions.
And there's a lot of stuff that should have been in this report, but wouldn't be in the report, partly because of their mandate, but partly because it's information that nobody's gathered yet.
Yes.
On page 187, the report notes that the monitoring system, which went into effect on November 1st, 2018, is not intended to assess compliance with the criminal code exemptions. You would sort of wonder why they put a monitoring program in place if it wasn't going to assure compliance with the rules of the program, but oh well, I guess they don't care about that.
And they want to be sure that nobody will ever be arrested or sued because something happened.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So
But something happened.
right. The authors also mention the reports of Quebec's Commission on End-of-Life Care, but they skip over the findings of those reports, which show that several people who were not eligible have already been euthanized.
Okay, we take a report and take only what is suited to us to be useful. The rest, we don't look at it.
Right. We'll talk about, oh, isn't it great that Quebec has these reports? We're not going to say it's in them, but you know. Okay. Bill C-14 limits the working group's mandate to situations where a mental disorder is the only reason for the assisted suicide or euthanasia request, without looking at how mental disorders affect the decision-making ability or interfere with the voluntariness of requests of people who are eligible because of a disability or a terminal illness. So they're acting like that, you know, there are these people who only have psychiatric conditions, who don't have anything physically wrong with them, who are asking. And they're ignoring the many more people who have, you know, who are asking because of physical conditions. And they have psychiatric issues as well. And
it happened quite a lot of time because sometimes it's linked.
right.
Most of the time it's linked together.
There are things, yeah. So as we know, the stress of illness and disability and coming to grips with having a new disability and the abuses, discrimination, and barriers faced by disabled people can trigger or worsen mental illness. And while we understand that the working group was unwilling to go beyond its legislative mandate, we believe that not exploring the impact of mental illness and physical disabilities together does a great disservice to the Canadian public. So we feel like, yeah, they weren't supposed to do it, but they really should have done it anyway, because if they want to do a good job, that's what they should have done. But they didn't, so oh well.
So it's not a good job.
Okay, so one more point before we get to the details. On page 68, the report said, of course a desire to die may reflect a person's autonomous and well-considered decision to end their life. Starting this sentence with "of course" implies that everyone is in agreement about what they're about to hear. In fact, the idea that ending one's life can be an autonomous and well-considered decision is only a theory, that being rational suicide, advocated by a few psychologists. It is not accepted in mainstream mental health practice.
And a good proof that not everybody agree, we are there.
Right. There we are, disagreeing. The assumption that underlie the theory that having a disability is a fate worse than death and that suffering at the end of life is inevitable have been consistently challenged by disability rights activists like us.
I was going to say, here's where we come in, even though we don't necessarily have psychology degrees.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we've been doing this for, what, 35 years?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Honesty being the best policy instead of social factors and hardships that the authors talk about. The authors should say discrimination. And they do sometimes say discrimination, but this whole thing about social factors and social hardships is kind of silly. The report refers to difficulty coping with social hardships on page 41. For example, they state that women are more susceptible to depression and anorexia in part because of gender-based violence. That's a social hardship. That's discrimination.
Yes,
It's not a hardship.
They don't name it.
No,
Please be honest. The authors rightly point out that the relationship between social factors and mental disorders goes both ways. Social factors can increase a person's risk for developing a mental disorder, and having a mental disorder can increase a person's exposure and vulnerability to social factors that are detrimental to their mental health. And that's on page 45. All right, the authors describe the mistreatment of people with psychiatric disabilities on page 46 and 47, concluding that, quote, the history of mistreatment of many people with mental disabilities in the delivery of healthcare, the early asylums, the eugenics movement, the institutional abuses in the mid-20th century, and the failure to provide sufficient resources following deinstitutionalization.
And it's still going.
Right. Demonstrate how such people can be vulnerable to further mistreatment should eligibility for assisted suicide and euthanasia be extended to people with psychiatric disabilities. So it's good that they're recognizing this, and it's certainly more than we saw in the other reports. So
yes,
that's great.
They do some good finding.
Yeah. The authors point out that people with mental disorders have an increased risk of being the victim of crime, physical or emotional abuse, and sexual assault, that face restrictions on their civil rights and may be denied the opportunity to make decisions for themselves and manage their lives. And that's on page 45.
That's fact.
And I actually have to apologize because when I did the mailing today of the text, I forgot to put in a link to the report itself. We have page citations, but I forgot the link to the report. So you'll have to go to the our web page and look at the webcast text to find the link to the report. Okay, so on page 80, the authors also say that given the history of stigma and discrimination against people with mental disorders, there may be concerns that someone's decision to seek aid might be due to stigma or the perception of that people with mental disorders are burdens on families, and or that the families may pressure a person with a mental disorder to seek aid. May be concerns. I would say yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the authors don't refer to the extensive historical information that supports this statement, but instead cite a single study from the Netherlands that seems to contradict it. Oh,
yeah,
well.
the only one.
Right, but again, they did a good effort. Later, the authors point out another potential problem. Quote, some people may request assisted suicide and euthanasia because they cannot access or afford other mental health treatments that may reduce their suffering. This is a form of reduced voluntariness, i.e. lack of choice constrains voluntariness of choice, unquote. And that was on page 166. So
this is true.
All right, in section 3.5, the working group examines the impact of psychiatric disabilities on, quote, other specific populations, unquote, looking at women, immigrants, racial and cultural groups, LGBTQ plus folks, seniors, veterans, incarcerated people, and youth. In short, they look at every other specific population except people
us.
With disabilities. What is up with that?
And unfortunately, this omission isn't really anything new. Federal suicide prevention plans, among other documents that we've gotten to look at, do the same thing. So the real question here should be, how do we break this trend?
Yeah, yeah. And as we were talking about in the French webcast, unfortunately, it's kind of difficult because to the degree that they admit that there's a problem, they're admitting that there's discrimination, and they can't do that. That would be bad. They don't want to admit there's discrimination. Okay, so the report is full of debate on everything from the definition of terms like impulsivity or intolerable to larger questions like whether suicide is a free choice. And we talked before about why it's bad that disabled people weren't involved in the working groups, and this is another example. On the one hand, this is a quote, on the one hand, prohibiting maid MD-sumk may be seen as perpetuating paternalistic practices that restrict the civil liberties of people with mental disorders and deny them freedom, choice, and autonomy. On the other hand, permitting maid MD-sumk may be seen as devaluing people with mental disorders by suggesting that their lives may not be worth living and by promoting civil liberties without providing necessary resources. And that was on page 47 and 48. So yes, it's a very lively debate. And it really is the kind of debate that people with disabilities, physical and psychiatric, should have been involved with, and we weren't. And that's really a flaw. One faction recognizes the harms caused by discrimination and oppression, while another neoliberal faction seems to believe that a person's choices should be considered autonomous, even if a lack of services or supports impair their ability to make a free and informed choice.
That way of telling it, let me tell that. I had done some politics, and when you agree to disagree, that's a way to tell it, so you just tell it and forget it.
Yeah.
Okay? To make it disappear because you could not reach any agreement between two or more groups.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're wondering where the factions come in, they don't really say where people stand. So they'll say one member of the working group says A and another says B, but you don't know who it is or where the paper overall stands because of it.
Right.
But using mathematics, is it exactly the same if you see 2 + 2 = 4,
yeah.
And 2
times
2 made, we don't know exactly, maybe 4, maybe 3, maybe 5.
It may be, it's something.
But it's obvious, but we are not telling what happened.
And this kind of disagreement is restated several times on different themes in the report. And we gave another example on page 172. So you can look that up yourself.
Actually, I was hoping to talk a little bit about that page.
Yeah.
It left me confused because there was one part where they said some working group members don't want autonomy to be violated to further social change. So how I read that line is that people don't want to legalize assisted suicide in those circumstances. And the lack of legalization will provide an incentive for real mental health support to be offered. And no matter how you slice it, people's struggles should not be used to promote causes without their consent.
Right. And again, it's very hard to figure out where people are coming down on this and what their agendas are. And it's another reason why it would have been so good if there had been disabled people who are directly impacted. I hate that word, who were directly affected by this
There we
stuff
go.
involved in the discussion. That would have been a good thing. Because it wouldn't have been sort of a theoretical, you know, thought experiment, as you put it before. It would have been a real live, honest to goodness, what happens to people in real life kind of discussion. Okay, the authors note that the unique challenge of assessing decision-making capacity for medical assistance in dying, unquote, in people with mental disorders. And the desire to die could be a symptom of the condition. Also, distorted perceptions of intolerability and irremediability, i.e., the belief that nothing can ever make a person feel any better, are common symptoms of some psychiatric disabilities. This is especially true for people with depression and personality disorders, who represent about half of those who were euthanized for psychiatric conditions in the Netherlands.
Half of those.
Right. And you would think that they would figure out, hey, you know, this person's disability might be contributing to the reason they want to die, but, you know, it is so hard when you're in that place to hold on to the fact, hold on to your reality and understand that, no, this is your mental condition.
Looking from few people, probably in good health people, they say, oh, poor people, we have to end their suffering.
Right.
Yeah. And another strange thing that just occurred to me, what if people realize that's what's happening? Their desire to die is their condition affecting their brain.
Yes.
Let's help them die. Let's take that condition to its full conclusion.
Right. Yeah, and that's why this work is both so important to me and so scary to me at the same time, because I realize that my condition is making me want to die, even though that's not a real thing, except for it feels very real.
Right.
It's a feeling. It's not a condition, it's a feeling.
Right.
And feeling is difficult to manage.
Right.
But not impossible.
Right. This raises questions that are not really answered by the report, such as whether a person who is involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital under provincial law, because they are considered a danger to themselves, could be deemed eligible for assisted suicide. They don't answer it. They don't deal with it. Okay, so the authors make an important point about the evaluation and treatment of suffering. And this is a good one, and I'm glad they brought this up. Usually, an assessment of a patient's suffering is done to learn whether and how much suffering can be relieved. But in the case of assisted suicide and euthanasia, where the person is on a path toward a goal of death, so they've got their goal in mind, this is where I'm going. The suffering assessment must satisfy an eligibility criterion needed to achieve that goal. Any proposed treatment to relieve suffering might be seen as a barrier to achieving the goal of assisted suicide and euthanasia, and therefore would be deemed unacceptable. Even though the idea of assisted suicide is supposed to end their suffering, they feel that treatment for pain would be an obstacle, and that's a tricky thing, but it happens. Also, no other country allows the person's own opinion of whether treatment would be futile or what conditions of relief they would accept to determine their eligibility under this criteria.
We will be alone in the world.
Right. Other countries have it as a discussion and agreement between the person and the doctor, which may not be perfect, but at least it's better than the person themselves saying, I don't want treatment, and nothing can make me feel better.
Which sometimes, and even most of the time, it's not true.
Right. Exactly. Right. And it's part of your condition to feel that.
Yeah.
The discussion of suicide prevention in the report is based on the legal rule established in the Carter decision and Bill C-14 that there are suicides society will assist rather than prevent. The suicide prevention discussion is really about how society chooses who gets help to live and who gets help to die, and how they redefine suicide to make it not apply to people society wants to help to die.
But think about a minute. A suicide is a suicide. Whatever happening. If you suicide yourself, it's a suicide.
Right.
Even the last minute of your life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But again, you know, they're trying to futz with the definition of suicide.
They try, but
done by
a suicide is a suicide.
Right. The working group doesn't challenge the better dead than disabled mindset, because that is what drives the idea that some suicides should be assisted rather than prevented.
Yeah, it's why they never discuss that. Is it because if they try, they will ruin whatever they have done before.
Right. Right. The authors claim that everyone involved in this selection process is neutral and even-handed, even down to suicide prevention hotline volunteers. In their view of the working group, and this is a quote, in the view of the working group members, only circumstance where suicide prevention interventions are not offered is when aid is provided to someone who meets all requirements under C-14, unquote. It would be great if that were true, but it just isn't the experience of disabled people. And unfortunately, we don't have funding to do detailed academic studies of this stuff. We just know it. And unfortunately, when you have the direct experience and when you've seen it happen, that doesn't count. So, oh well.
Oh well, oh well.
Okay.
Question: would suicide interventions be given to someone who meets all but one requirement under C-14?
Right. And, you know, even if somebody met every requirement, why shouldn't they get suicide prevention interventions? You know, that's an important question.
At least it will be something to protect us against us a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I am mostly able to hold on to the insight that it's my brain misfunction that is telling me that I want to die. But what happens if one day I can't? You know, I want something there to back me up. Okay, the working group quotes from the suicide prevention framework saying that people experiencing thoughts of suicide may feel hopeless or overwhelmed and see no other option. But quoting that tends to discount the real problems like inadequate access to palliative care and being forced into an institution that create hopeless situations for disabled people more than just feelings of hopelessness. And again, it's not, they didn't address it in the report because they're not talking about the experience of disabled people. Frustrating. And this is exactly what Roger Foley is living. And yeah, they do mention him, but
they mention Roger Foley and Candace Lewis and Latimer, all three, and don't do a darn thing with them.
Right.
Anyway, I'm getting us sidetracked. Back to the script.
No, it's okay.
They find good information. They find some nice discovery, but they don't use it.
Right. And, you know, they ignore Latimer, Bolin.
Yeah. And many, many other.
Right. Okay. The report connects Bill C-14's concern for those who might end their lives in moments of weakness, which is part of the preamble, only to impulsivity and ambivalence, but not to the loss of resilience in the face of constant discrimination and barriers. Again, you're faced with this all the time. And they're just talking, oh, well, you know, this might be a question of impulsivity or ambivalence. No, this is wearing out when you just can't deal with it anymore, you know? And they don't talk about it because there are no disabled people involved. They don't get it. All right. Okay, the working group asks whether the medical model of disability might contribute to how suffering is defined, especially for autistics and people with intellectual disability. And I wish I could have said more about that, but I was really trying to keep this under an hour.
Yeah.
The authors address in passing how feelings of the medical practitioner may affect the determination that the person's mental disorder is treatable and or that their suffering can be relieved by or other criteria. A 1996 study noted that 19% or 13 cases of psychiatric assisted suicide and euthanasia were carried out despite the consultant's judgment that transference, meaning the person's redirected emotion from the past figure onto a psychiatrist, or countertransference, meaning the psychiatrist's emotional reaction to the person, had influenced the decision-making process.
This is very dangerous.
So, and especially happens with people with personality disorders, it can be very, very, very trying to work with somebody with a personality disorder. I've done that when I was doing mental health advocacy stuff. It's very difficult, and psychiatrists, psychologists get really tired of it sometimes, and they just want to say, screw you. And if that's what's going on, and the person is saying, I want to die, and the psychiatrist says, screw you, then the person dies. The person is deemed eligible, and there they go. On pages 157 and 158, the authors talk about a therapeutic effect whereby some people who were approved for psychiatric assisted suicide and euthanasia in Belgium withdrew their requests because knowing they had the option gave them sufficient peace of mind to continue their lives. But the authors don't offer any alternatives for achieving the same effect, such as enabling the person to take control of their lives.
Yeah, some measure to do that may be very simple.
Yeah. I feel like we're broken records here, because the next obvious question is, how do we help people take control of their lives? But that comes up in here every week.
Yeah, but we say it every week. Consumer control personal assistance services, access to palliative care, not shunting people into institutions. It may seem elementary to us, and we have to repeat it a zillion times because obviously it's not getting through. Okay. The working group proposes some safeguards that could be put into effect if assisted suicide and euthanasia were allowed for people with psychiatric disabilities, which we don't think is a good idea. Some of these are policies that should be in place anyway, such as psychiatric evaluation for capacity. Yeah. Oh, what an idea.
Okay, make it shorter for people who are not, who doesn't have the difficulty with their mental health. But at least do a bit of that.
Yeah, there should be a psychiatric evaluation for capacity. There should also be a multidisciplinary evaluation to consider psychological, social, and other non-medical factors that affect the voluntariness of a decision. and suffering. How's that?
Yeah.
Mandatory reporting and case review. Whoa, what a concept!
Yeah, what a revelation.
Yeah.
Other possible safeguards include a two-track approach where one mental health professional assesses the assisted suicide and euthanasia eligibility of the person, while the other pursues treatment. So that might eliminate that problem where the person is so focused on assisted suicide and euthanasia, they refuse any kind of help or treatment. It might, I don't know. And the other possibility is an extended waiting period of up to a year.
Okay, help me figure this one out. Because to me, the waiting period looks like an Hang on, let me backtrack. With most assisted suicide laws, they want you to be 6 months or less away from the end of your life. Right. So to make somebody wait a year looks like an extreme limit that you would start with to frustrate legislators so that they would put a more reasonable limit in place so that you can make them propose what you want them to start with and it doesn't look so bad.
I think the justification for a longer waiting period is that with psychiatric disabilities, and again, this would only apply to people whose sole concern was a psychiatric disability.
Okay.
Treatment modalities take a long time to take effect. The selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, take at least 2 weeks to start working. And most of the other medications, the tricyclics and the MAO inhibitors also take a while to work. And also, if you're trying to do therapy in conjunction with medication, that can take a while as well to have a noticeable effect. And so I think that's what they're aiming at, is to give people enough time for a treatment to actually have an effect. And whether or not it works, I don't know.
There is another thing that could happen either. In the same time, all those measures, if you put it together, it rise the price of putting people to death, and rising the price putting people to death diminish the chance to make it only a money thing.
Right. So that's. But, I think you're right in the sense that nobody's going to go for that because people are already clamoring to make the process quicker with less paperwork and less requirements. So nobody's going to allow for a longer waiting period.
Yes, but it's always in the same meaning that people are in their end of life, something like that.
Right.
But for mental disorder, nobody is at their end of life.
Right.
Or it's going to be a mental health condition in conjunction with something else.
Right.
Yes, if it's in conjunction, it's another thing.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another safeguard they're considering is requiring an agreement between the physician and the person who is making the request that treatment would be futile, and that's what they have in the Netherlands, and that the person try any reasonable treatment options unless they can demonstrate good cause not to. And my example of that is that if anybody ever recommends to me that I try electroconvulsive therapy, I will say no, because my memory is so important to my functioning as a blind person that I cannot put it at risk.
But you should try another.
But other things I'll try.
Yeah.
So there you go. All right. The mental disorders report has some good points. It raises issues of discrimination and barriers more than the other documents. There is a lot of material here. This is the longest report by 30 pages, yet there remained important questions that were beyond the scope of what the working group was supposed to cover. We could only scratch the surface in our analysis, and we had to leave a lot of stuff out. It's obvious that some intense debates took place in crafting this report, and that disability rights activists were not part of these discussions greatly reduces the value of the document, in our opinion. So, anything else you want to say, Taylor?
Nope. There was something we touched on in the French version that we didn't really get to this time around, and I'd like to make sure we fit it in. I just need to find out where it is.
Okay.
The working group asked about the medical model of disability and the perception of suffering for people with intellectual disabilities.
Oh, yes. And actually did say that, but we didn't discuss it at all.
Yeah, we didn't expand on it.
Right.
A couple months ago, I had the opportunity to Skype into a conference related to these papers through the University of Alberta. And one gentleman who presented proposed this thought experiment of who would be better off living in outer space with the support of a robot, somebody with an intellectual disability or without one.
Yeah. I think he would.
How foreign does neurodiversity and intellectual disability have to be to you?
Right.
You propose all these outlandish things.
Right. And and the researchers just see themselves as so separate and apart from the experience that it is a game to them. Let's play a game.
Yeah. Let's just do this philosophical experiment, not realizing that there are people living under the conditions of your experiment who the results actually affect.
Right. Exactly. Yep. Okay. So if you would like more information about the topics that we discuss here, you can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/toujours vivant, not dead yet. That's all one word. You can visit our website at tvndy.ca. You can email us at info@signtv-ndy.ca, or you can follow us on Twitter @signtvndy. Thanks to Christian for helping out.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks to Taylor for helping out as well.
Somewhere down in the corner of your screen over here.
We will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.